Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all having a fantastic day. Before we begin, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. The morning of Rob Reiner's funeral arrived with an eerie stillness, the kind that made even the loudest cities feel hushed. Hollywood, normally buzzing with premieres, scandals, and flashing cameras, seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Inside a quiet chapel tucked away from prying eyes, the invited guests gathered. Longtime collaborators, close friends, family members, and a few silent legends whose faces had aged alongside Rob's own career. But what no one expected was that 7 uninvited guests would also attend, some in flesh, some in memory, and some in ways far more unsettling. They were not listed on the program. They were not welcomed, and yet they came anyway. 1. The estranged friend who never forgave him. He arrived early, sitting in the back row, his hat pulled low over his eyes. No one recognized him at first, not until whispers began to circulate. Once, decades ago, he and Rob Reiner had been inseparable. They had shared late-night scripts, bitter arguments, and dreams of changing cinema forever. But one disagreement, about credit, about power, about ego, had shattered everything. Rob had moved on. He had not. No one invited him. Yet there he was, silently watching the casket. His jaw clenched, his eyes glassy, not with grief but with unresolved anger. When the service ended, he left without a word, carrying something far heavier than sorrow. Regret that had never found closure. 2. The role that was taken away. Some guests did not walk through the doors. They lingered in the air. Actors spoke quietly about it afterward, about the strange feeling that followed them all day. One role in particular haunted the room, a character Rob had written but never cast, a part rewritten so many times it ceased to exist. It was a story Rob once believed would change everything. It never did. That abandoned role, that unrealized vision, felt present like a shadow hovering behind the podium. The words spoken during the eulogy echoed off invisible walls of what could have been. Uninvited, yes, but unforgettable. 3. The critic who tried to destroy him. Midway through the service, an older man stood near the aisle, pretending to blend in. Those who knew Hollywood history felt a chill. He was a critic, a powerful one. Years ago, he had written a review so brutal it nearly ended Rob Reiner's career. The words were merciless, personal, and cruel. Studios hesitated, scripts stalled, doors closed. Rob never responded publicly, but privately, that review followed him for years. Now, the critic stood quietly, head bowed, finally understanding the weight of influence. No one had invited him. No one acknowledged him. Yet he came, perhaps seeking forgiveness from a man who could no longer give it. 4. The younger version of Rob Reiner. This guest was invisible to everyone, except those who truly understood legacy. The young Rob Reiner, the one full of fire, conviction, and fearless opinions, sat quietly among the mourners. He watched his older self's life being summarized in minutes. The triumphs, the controversies, the contradictions. This version of Rob wondered silently. Did we change the world like we promised? Did we become what we once criticized? Was it worth it? He was not invited because no one can invite their past. Yet he was present all the same. 5. The films that never got made. Outside the chapel, the wind carried whispers of unfinished scripts. Projects Rob had pitched but never funded. Stories shelved due to politics, timing, or fear. Some were too bold, some too honest, some too ahead of their time. These films stood like ghosts, titles that never appeared on posters, scenes that never reached audiences, ideas that never found their moment. Fellow filmmakers felt it deeply. One whispered he talked about that project for years. Those films came uninvited, lining the walls with silent frames that only creatives could see. 6. The controversy that followed him to the end. Not all legacies are clean. Some controversies refuse to stay buried. Rob Reiner was outspoken, sometimes admired, sometimes criticized, often divisive. Political opinions, public statements, fierce debates. These things followed him everywhere. Even here. Mourners shifted uncomfortably when certain moments were mentioned, not because they hated him, but because history is complicated. This uninvited guest wasn't a person. It was public opinion, sitting quietly among the flowers, reminding everyone that no life, especially a public one, is simple. 7. The audience who loved him in silence. They never entered the chapel. They couldn't, but they were there. Millions of viewers who grew up watching his films. Families who laughed, cried, argued, and bonded over stories he helped bring to life. People who never met him, never shook his hand, yet felt connected to his work. They watched from afar, online, in living rooms, through old DVDs and streaming platforms. They were not invited because the chapel could not hold them, but their presence was undeniable. The unspoken truth. As the service ended and the crowd dispersed, one thing became clear. A funeral is never just about the people who attend. It's about the memories that arrive unannounced, the conflicts that never healed, the dreams that stayed unfinished, the versions of ourselves we leave behind. Rob Reiner's funeral wasn't crowded with strangers. It was crowded with truths. Some comforting, some painful, some unresolved. And maybe that is the most honest farewell anyone can have. Because in the end, the uninvited guests tell the real story. As the final guests drifted away and the chapel doors closed, silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was full of echoes. The chairs still seemed warm, as if conversations had not fully let go. The air carried fragments of laughter from old movie sets, heated debates from editing rooms, and quiet moments when Rob Reiner sat alone, staring at a blank page, wondering if the next idea would be his best or his last. Outside, the sky had turned a muted gray, neither mourning nor celebrating, simply observing. A few clouds moved slowly, like reluctant witnesses unwilling to leave the scene. And still, the uninvited guests remained. What the eulogies couldn't say. Inside the chapel, eulogies had followed a familiar rhythm. Praise, gratitude, admiration. Words like visionary, fearless, iconic were spoken carefully, polished for public memory. But none of the speakers mentioned the nights Rob doubted himself. No one spoke of the calls that went unanswered, the projects rejected without explanation, or the quiet fear that relevance might someday slip away. Those truths didn't fit neatly into speeches, yet they stood there anyway, uninvited, leaning against the walls. Those who truly knew Rob felt them. They remembered the man behind the opinions, the filmmaker behind the headlines, the human being behind the certainty. A pause between applause. One mourner lingered long after everyone else had gone. He stood near the podium, staring at it as if expecting Rob to step out from behind the curtain and argue one last point. Hollywood rarely pauses long enough to reflect, but today it did. There was no applause, no cameras flashing, no closing credits, just a rare, uncomfortable stillness, one that asked questions instead of answering them. The quiet reckoning. Funerals have a way of confronting the living. Several guests left change, not dramatically but subtly. One director decided to revive a script he'd abandoned out of fear. Another reached out to an old friend, realizing that time is far less patient than pride. Rob Reiner, even in absence, was still influencing choices. That may have been his final act, the unfinished conversation. Somewhere beyond the chapel, beyond the flowers and stone markers, there existed an unfinished conversation between Rob and the world he challenged so relentlessly. He had pushed boundaries. He had sparked arguments. He had refused to stay silent when silence felt easier. That conversation didn't end with his funeral. It simply changed speakers. What remains after everyone leaves? Long after the last car drove away, one truth remained clear. A person's legacy is never just their achievements. It is the discomfort they cause, the inspiration they ignite, the debates they refuse to avoid, the stories they leave others to finish. Rob Reiner's funeral was not an ending. It was a mirror, and in that mirror stood everyone who had ever watched, listened, argued, or believed. Because the uninvited guests never really leave. They live on, in memory, in influence, and in the questions we're brave enough to keep asking. The chapel lights dimmed automatically, responding to the emptiness, but the room did not feel vacant. If anything, it felt heavier, like the walls themselves were holding on to something they weren't ready to release. Outside, the wind stirred the fallen programs scattered near the steps. Rob Reiner's name, printed in elegant black letters, bent and folded under passing feet. A custodian paused before sweeping them away, hesitating, as if discarding paper also meant discarding meaning. Inside, time stretched. The silence after legacy. There is a moment after every funeral when the truth settles in, not the polished version spoken aloud, but the raw understanding that a voice has gone quiet forever. Rob's voice, once unmistakable, no longer challenged rooms or demanded attention. And for those who had built their careers arguing with him, opposing him, or even standing beside him, the silence felt unnatural. One producer sat alone in the front row, replaying a conversation from years earlier, an argument that ended abruptly, unresolved. He had always assumed there would be another chance. There always seemed to be time. That assumption had been wrong. The uninvited guest of finality made itself known then, slipping quietly into every mind still present. The weight of influence. Rob Reiner had never been just a filmmaker. He was a force, sometimes welcomed, sometimes resisted. People didn't merely work with him, they reacted to him. His opinions had shaped conversations long after the cameras stopped rolling. Now, those opinions hovered without their owner. Some felt relief, some felt loss. Most felt confusion. Without Rob there to provoke debate, the world seemed slightly less sharp, slightly less awake. That realization unsettled more people than they expected. A memory that refused to fade. In the corner of the chapel, a woman closed her eyes and suddenly found herself decades in the past, standing on a set, young and nervous, watching Rob give direction with confidence that bordered on defiance. He had believed in her when few others did. She'd opened her eyes again, fighting tears. This memory hadn't been invited, but it demanded space anyway. Across the room, others experienced the same quiet ambush, moments replaying without warning, laughter, frustration, pride, disappointment, gratitude. The uninvited guests multiplied. The question no one asked out loud. As people slowly returned to their cars, one question followed them, unspoken but persistent. Who takes his place now? Not in title, not in fame, but in willingness. Who would speak when silence felt safer? Who would risk being disliked in order to be heard? Who would challenge comfort the way Rob always had? The question had no immediate answer. Perhaps that was the point. What the grave couldn't hold. Later that evening, as the sun slipped behind the horizon, Rob Reiner's grave stood still and unremarkable, like all the others. Stone and earth made no distinction between legends and ordinary lives. But what lay beneath could not contain what he left behind. Stories continued circulating. Arguments resumed online. Films were rewatched with new eyes. Critics reassessed. Admirers defended. Detractors softened, if only slightly. The conversation lived on. Uninvited. Uncontained. Unfinished. The final uninvited guest. And then there was the last presence, the one no one noticed until much later. Perspective. Time has a way of reshaping reputations. What once seemed controversial may later feel courageous. What once felt loud may one day sound necessary. Perspective had arrived without ceremony, quietly taking a seat among history's judges. Rob Reiner would not be here to witness that verdict. But perhaps he never needed to be. After the story ends, long after the chapel was cleaned, the flowers removed, and the moment officially labeled over, something remained unresolved in the best possible way, because legacies aren't meant to rest peacefully. They're meant to argue with the future. And Rob Reiner, even in absence, was still doing exactly that.